So hello and welcome. And today the theme in this week's series is happiness. A particular kind of happiness that in a sense has no reason, external reason. Isn't that we've won a prize or some wonderful things happening in the world. But rather a happiness that comes with doing the practice, the mindfulness, the meditation practice, a kind of contentment, a warmth, a pleasure that comes from being immersed in the practice itself, without any distractions, without any reference points of other things that we want or that we don't want, that should happen in the world, or our concerns about what's coming or what's happened before. The immersion here in this moment's experience. So I'd like to say this, that what the mind, what attention focuses on can have an influence on the mind. What the mind feeds on affects the health of the mind, the state of the mind. So if the mind feeds on a lot of horror movies, then it might be not a surprise that we spend a good amount of time being afraid. If we spend a lot of time with friends who mostly are angry, complaining, cynical, and that's what we focus on, there's no surprise then that gets reinforced, that habit to be that way. If we spend a lot of time on advertisements, maybe no surprise that then we end up strengthening our desires. If we focus on genuine or healthy happiness, that affects and influences the mind differently than these earlier ones. And so what we focus on is food or effects or is an influence on the mind itself. If we do it regularly and repeatedly, what we think about, same thing. So it's helpful in meditation to lower the bar for what we think happiness or joy is. Maybe it's a very subtle contentment or a subtle sense of pleasure of simply sitting here and being here. And to include that in the focus of attention. Let that be a food. Let that be what the mind feeds on or grows with. Now, mindfulness practice is often about being present for what is, whatever is predominant. And so what I'm saying might seem contradictory. Focus on something that's subtle and ignore the predominant desires that I'm caught up in or the anger that I'm involved in. It's a little different in that we definitely want to be present for what is, but we want to notice that the being present, being mindful, being aware, and here I use the word being as a kind of deliberateness, a kind of conscientiousness or kind of conscious presence and awareness. That deliberateness or that engagement of awareness, that way of being aware, it's possible to find happiness, pleasure in that. So if we're being mindful of our anger, being mindful of our greed or whatever it might be, the way not to have the anger and the greed be fed is to step away from participating in these unwholesome, unhealthy mind states. And in stepping away, look at them, be aware of them, watch them, and appreciate the watching, appreciate the awareing of them, the awareness. Appreciate feel a contentment, a joy, a kind of happiness in being aware as opposed to in participating with. So as we sit here today, as you bring up your mindfulness to being aware of the present moment in your experience, with a very low bar, very low standard of what qualifies, see if you can be aware while there's a pleasure of mindfulness, the pleasure, the contentment for being aware. Maybe a delight, maybe not something you're actively thinking about too much, but just the nature of being aware. The nature of mindfulness contains within it some pleasure, some goodness, something that feels this is good, this is valuable, this moment is content to be aware this way. To bring that along with your mindfulness, then that is what feeds the mind. That's what influences the mind. It's a protection from being influenced by the greed or the anger or whatever it might be, unhealthy mind states, mind activities, while being aware of them at the same time. So hopefully that's clear. So, assuming your meditation posture, and gently closing your eyes, and slowly and deliberately bring a sense of gentleness into your body. Being gentle with what is not gentle. Being gentle with the tensions, the agitations, the emotions that might be in your body. A gentle awareness of them. And if you find your body muscles being tense, almost as if you're not doing anything, but being aware of them, the tension, allow the tension to release, if it wants to release. Allow your body to relax, if that's what your body wants to do. And then allow awareness to gently be with the movements of the body breathing. Wherever that movement of breathing, sensations of breathing, are the easiest or most enjoyable to experience. And as you're aware of your breathing, maybe also aware of any tension and agitation in the mind. And if that tension wants to relax, allow the mind to soften, to relax. And then again, becoming aware of breathing more fully, where there's a light touch in the body. Light touch between awareness and breathing. And awareness touches the experience of breathing lightly, but broadly. Not the fingertip touching, but the whole hand of awareness, making a light contact with the body breathing. Awareness floating on the rhythm of breathing in and breathing out. If you find yourself thinking, it isn't so much that you let go of your thoughts as you let go of your interest and involvement with them. So you can be more interested and more involved in the contact between breathing and awareness. And then as you're aware, you might be aware of breathing, thoughts arising, sounds, sensations, emotions. All these things might come into awareness. See if you can also include, be aware of a contentment, a happiness, a pleasure in being aware. What you're aware of might not be pleasant and happy, but some way that being aware, deliberately, consciously, knowing what's happening as it's happening, lightly, gently, openly, whatever way that feels comes with happiness, contentment. Include that as you're being aware. Maybe you can let there be a happiness in the knowing, in the awareing. Instead of giving yourself over to your thoughts, give yourself over to being aware, here, now, sensitive to the slightest pleasure or happiness that comes with being aware. And if there is pain or discomfort anywhere, physically, emotionally, is there a way of lightening up, gentling on how you're aware of it? Opening up the awareness so that awareness of it has a contentment or pleasure or happiness, or a feeling of rightness. This feels right to be aware this way. So then as we come to the end of this sitting, imagine that how you're aware of the world is offering medicine or food for the world. That if you're aware of the world, if you know the world from fear or from anger, from greed or lust, you're putting into the world something very different than if you're aware of the world with contentment and happiness, with joy, pleasure, love, kindness. at least the kind of pleasure or contentment that can come from being aware itself. The awareness that allows us to see clearly and honestly what is here in this world without being entangled in it. To be aware in a way that is, the awareness itself contains a joy, a happiness, a pleasure, the joy of non-clinging, the joy of being present. To be aware in this way provides a healthy food, medicine for this world that we live in. May we bring the joy, the happiness of mindfulness into all our encounters, even the ones which are unpleasant, even the ones that we have other emotions, but at least we have the subtle pleasure, happiness of mindfulness itself. May our mindfulness be a healthy influence on this world that we live in. May it contribute to the welfare and happiness of all beings. May all beings be happy. May all beings be safe. May all beings be peaceful. And may all beings everywhere be free. Thank you. So this is the fourth talk on the Gladness Pentad. And the fourth of these 5 qualities is happiness, sukha. And because sukha is sometimes translated as pleasure, there's 2 conclusions about the kind of happiness we're talking about. One is that pleasure is something we mostly can feel through our body. There's a physicality to it. And so this is a happiness which has a sublime or pleasant pleasure somehow in the body. It's not excited. It's something that's settling and quieting. And the other is that this sukha, this happiness, is not to be happy about anything, but rather it's the happy in doing, in activity. So to be immersed in an activity, that just the immersion, the absorption, the giving ourselves over to it, I like this, like giving ourselves over to it, to really be there, not to forget ourselves, not to disconnect, but to really, in mindfulness, to really give ourselves over to this, immerse ourselves in this world of practice. And as the practice, the strength of it builds, that immersion in the practice is not something that we say, okay, now I'm going to do this, but rather something we enter into, we settle into, that opens up for us with the strength of our practice and our ability to, our strength in not being caught in thoughts. So there's a momentum that builds through practice that begins with faith, with trust, with inspiration in the practice itself, so that we want to practice. And so we sit down, we're glad to be able to practice. We're glad, there's something that we're glad, that wow, I'm glad I've been busy, running around like crazy all day, and it's so good to finally sit down and sit quiet and not be so busy. Or, wow, this is so important for me, this practice, and I do it every day, but this is like the center of how I want to live my life, is what comes from this practice. So I'm so glad to be back here at home in this practice. So for each of us it's going to be different, but there's a gladness. And that gladness is a little bit of a encouragement, a cheerleader, and to start really giving ourselves to doing the practice. We sit down to meditate, and we find ourselves interested in the challenge we have with a local neighbor, and how a local neighbor is not being right, or being unfair or something. And that might be an important topic, but we sit down, and that's not what this meditation is about. You're finally here at home. You have something you love doing, and you're so happy to be able to do it. The concerns with the neighbors can wait for another time. So there's a momentum then in being glad to do it, and that gladness, that we start doing it, we start feeling hooked in or plugged in to being mindful. That being mindful is, you feel like there's a life of its own. The practice, it's doing itself for us now. It's not constantly coming back, constantly applying ourselves. But we're kind of like, now we're on the conveyor belt. Like, okay, now we're kind of coming along. And that conveyor belt feeling of being in the practice, in the engagement, engagement itself starts feeling kind of a delightful joy, kind of a very subtle, pleasant, maybe thrill, or a little bit of excitement. Oh yes, we're here, we're present. And that's a feeling that maybe is felt in the arms, in the chest, sometimes in the face. It feels like maybe something's vibrating, or something's energized, or there's a lightness or a clarity or a tingling or a sense of flowing pleasure to that immersion. And then we're so happy to be doing it, something relaxes and lets go. Oh, I'm here. I can trust this. I can now relax more fully. And so there isn't a need to apply oneself so much in meditation. Something about the tension of application relaxes, and the body relaxes and settles. And with that settling of the body, quieting, tranquilizing the body, then the gladness and the joy transforms into a kind of happiness, a kind of contentment, a kind of embodied pleasure that is not kind of hedonistic pleasure. It just feels so satisfying that it doesn't feel right to call it pleasure. Maybe it feels better as kind of a happiness that feels light, that feels quiet, that feels still. It feels more settled and gentle than the joyful immersion that came earlier in the practice. So this momentum begins happening, and this is one of the great things about practice, to find ourselves on the conveyor belt of practice. And some people at this point in practice will talk about, it isn't that they're doing the practice, but they are being practiced. It's almost like a practice is doing us rather than we're doing the practice. And so, and a big part of the practitioner's role at this point is making sure we don't mess it up. We don't get in the way of it. We don't get caught up in thoughts or control or trying to make it better or fixing it or holding on to it. It's mostly just kind of stay out of the way. If there's too many cooks in the kitchen, it doesn't work. And so the extra cook is you. And so you have to kind of stay present for sure, but you mostly have to kind of stay, out of the kitchen. So one of the ways of understanding this pleasure, to make it more accessible perhaps, because it might seem a little bit much, this idea of being on the conveyor belt and being carried along, is to feel it be content and happy how subtle it can be, how small it can be. And one of the ways of doing this is, as we kind of cultivate mindfulness practice and get used to it and being aware and being present, being in the moment, here and now, recognizing what's happening, offering our presence, our attention to what's happening here. If we're drinking tea, eating food, opening a door, being with our breathing, listening to someone, that there's a kind of a heightened attentiveness a feeling of kind of deliberateness of being present and receptive to what's happening. And then to begin feeling, recognizing that there is some pleasure, some goodness, something healthy, some happiness, joy, in being aware itself. Some of this might be evaluative, like all these different steps of the Pentad. It might be that the happiness of being inspired, I'm getting to do this practice. Look at me. It's like, Ma, look, riding the bicycle with no hands. Look at this. I was aware of 3 breaths in a row. Look at this. I was listening to my friend. My friend said something difficult, and I didn't habitually kind of lash out, or I just stayed and was present. Wow, this is good. So that's evaluative gladness. And then you keep listening, and it just feels good to have this ability to be attentive and open. And you see that your friend who's complaining about something, that something shifts in them because you're just present in a non-reactive way. And you start appreciating your non-reactivity in a deeper way. And then it allows you to relax into it. And then in that relaxing, you feel that there's a subtle in the awareness itself, not evaluative, not evaluating it, but rather in the tone of it, in the texture of it, there is some happiness, some contentment, some pleasure. And to stay gently aware of that pleasure, that goodness, that what's healthy about that kind of awareness is very useful, because what we pay attention to is what influences the quality and texture and state of our mind and heart. And if we're only aware of and focus on what's painful, difficult, with our anger and our grief and our sadness and our conceit and our discouragement and all kinds of things like that, if we get kind of too absorbed in it without being aware, then that is cyclic. It influences the mind and heart, and we feel worse, and then we become more aware of it, and we feel worse still. We have to step out of the loop of these things affecting us negatively. And one way to do that is have enough awareness that we feel the goodness of being aware, the goodness of being not lost in something or influenced or in the grip of something. And to feel it's just subtlest kind of, keep the bar very low, the subtlest forms of contentment, happiness, joy, satisfaction, that comes along with being aware. If you're aware of something difficult, if you're being mindful of something difficult, and while you know the difficulty, you also know the satisfaction of being mindful, then your practice is really getting strong. Because then you're not somehow glued or being influenced by the difficulty. You're actually starting to become, it's actually the mindfulness is protecting you from being influenced by the difficulty, the difficult mind states you might have. And not only is it protecting you from being influenced by difficult mind states, it's also feeding you with this the goodness of the practice itself, the happiness, the satisfaction of the practice itself of being mindful. And even if it's very, very small, it's a fantastic food. It's fantastic for our heart, our mind, our body to appreciate, to feel that. So as you go about your day, you might experiment a bit or notice. There might be 1 or 2 times during the day would you get really absorbed in something, some irritation, some anger, some desire, some fear about something, and maybe it's not imminent. It's like not right in front of you, the thing. It's more like the mind projecting and thinking about the future or something that's something or some person somewhere else. And you find yourself, caught, involved in that in a strong, intense way. Turn your awareness to the way that you're caught in something like this, that kind of, that could theoretically have a negative influence on you if you imagine you're being fed a diet of this. Turn around and be mindful of it. Really know that it's there, and see how clear the mindfulness has to be, how much you have to step back or open up in the awareness to really know this is what's happening. I'm really angry here. I'm really afraid here. And how, until you come to that place where there's a satisfaction, maybe the satisfaction of not being caught. There's a joy, the joy of having this wonderful practice to do that's an alternative to being caught. Or the happiness that can come with you're so content. Wow, this is so good that I'm being nourished now in my mindfulness, even though I'm present with a difficult state. So it's a homework assignment in noticing the difference between being immersed in something and lost in it and almost like influenced it, or stepping back until you find the happiness of mindfulness. And some of you maybe won't know until after it's over that you were really caught up in something. And it might be interesting to, even when you finally notice it, reviewing the day, there might be a way then in the reviewing of the day that maybe you can do the exercise there and find where that happiness is. So, so thank you very much, and I look forward to the conclusion of this Pentad tomorrow.